Good day, everyone. You're listening to an attempt to understand again with myself, Adam Dean. Thank you very much for joining me today. So, today we are talking about The Call of the Wild. The Call of the Wild is a classic children's story by Jack London. It came out a long time ago, and it has been adapted into several different pieces of media, including a film with Harrison Ford that I have not seen, a film with a bunch of other people from a longer time ago I have not seen, and I'm sure probably a bunch of other media pieces that I have not seen. But what I have seen, my dear listener, is I have seen the book. In meaning, I have read it and I have enjoyed it, and I'm here to talk about it today. So, The Call of the Wild follows a dog called Buck. Almost escaped me there. How ironic. It follows Buck, and Buck is like the second born of a family dog, and he is, really he lives a life of leisure. He doesn't have any large problems in his life. He doesn't even have like duties that's expected of him, as he's not like a working dog on a farm or anything like that. He really just potters about. He goes like out hunting with the family when he feels like it, and he's really just like rocking it. He's just enjoying his life. And that is until he is sold by one of the staff members on the property into what is essentially, I suppose, dog slavery. But, I mean, he is sold to be a Yukon sled dog. And essentially, we follow Buck on this journey, as he starts off a very naive, young kind of dog. And he is very quickly introduced to what is referenced as the law of club and fang, which is to say that humans and people have kind of complete control over these animals, and Buck comes to realize that because they wield the clubs, and I suppose that would be the first. Not a warning, but that would be the first kind of other point. To be fair, people, is that you're gonna see a lot of violence in this book. There is, I mean, it's a kid's book, but it is most definitely pretty brutal. Right from the start, you're seeing a lot of like beatings of dogs. You're getting descriptions of the clubs coming down on their hind legs. There's a lot of dogs attacking other dogs and stuff like that. When Buck joins the crew, obviously he like knows nothing, and the whole story is told from Buck's perspective. It's not, through each of the owners as they have him. It is literally told from Buck's perspective, so that he kind of knows only what Buck knows, which is a really interesting way to tell the story. I remember reading a different book a year or so ago, and it was told from the perspective of the ghosts in the graveyard of the town. And then, that was able to give a lot of information in different ways to the audience, which was really interesting. And I felt this was kind of similar. You don't see it too often where it's from a dog's perspective, and it's not just a similar vibe to Look Who's Talking, where it's just John Travolta, riffing as a baby. But this was really well done. So like I said, we follow Buck through his journey, and at first, he has some really harsh owners, like that just are beating the law of the land into him, making sure he understands like his place and his job and all this stuff. And eventually, he learns his lessons, he becomes a more competent sled dog, and he goes on to new owners. And then for a bit of time, you see him you see him fear what's going to happen to him, not even out of fear for being beaten that's already happened, or fear of being attacked by the dogs in his own troop over, who's the leader and stuff like that. But fear for his life, because he finally has an understanding of like what he should be doing and what should be happening, and then he's immediately sold to people who have no idea what they're doing, and they basically kill nearly all of the dogs by running them to exhaustion through like soft snow, until eventually they all fall into like a massive lake, So plot wise, that really leads us to the proper meat of the story, I would say, which is really when Buck finds his life in possession of a really kind man called John Thornton. And Thornton, he was really kind to Buck. He really looked at Buck as like an actual companion and not just another object or another tool, really. And Buck finds a slice of freedom again with Thornton. He kind of proves himself as leader of the pack, as the most experienced and kind of edged dog, and then he's able to kind of come and go as he please for a bit of time, and it's around this point in the story that that Buck starts to really hear the call, you know. It's after he's kind of beaten and he's worn down and he's learned these lessons, and it's after all of this stuff that he finally is kind of blessed with this little bit of peace again with Thornton, and he actually experiences like love from this owner, and that's something that Jack London details quite a bit, because he makes sure to reference that Buck never really felt like fulfillment or true like bonded love with people, with his original owners on like this big farm property and everything, because he was loved as like a group part of the family, but it's described that he never feels like this deep connection with like one particular person or anything, and that is what he finds in Thornton, you know. But it's at this point, like I said, that he starts to hear the call. And the call is kind of described as like these like ancestral embedded habits, these kind of actions that the ancestors did for so long that it's embedded into the subconscious of Buck to want to get out there and re-pursue that. So he starts, like I said, I can't speak. He starts coming and going as he pleases. He starts going and running with like these wild wolves, and he starts like hunting these animals and stuff when he's out, and taking on challenges, seeing if he can like hunt a hare and kill it, seeing if he can take down like a massive moose and stuff like that. And like I said, a lot of violence, a very violent book. But it's at this point that Buck is really carved a new version of his life out. There's even a point that he is with Thornton. They're like in a town, and all these men are kind of taking bets, and Thornton starts to take money to see if Buck could move like this massive sled, and it describes the weight. I forget the exact thing. It's like £100 or something like that. But Thornton essentially wins like $1,000 or something back when that's, I don't know, like 50 grand. Because he is able to take all of these bets that Buck is able to move this sled, and the sled is like frozen to the ground, and they force Buck to like pull it and unstick it. And he ends up winning a lot of money in that bet. So it's like everything's kind of coming to fruition. He's earned a place, he's given value to his owner, and his kind of identity is essentially wrapped up in these tasks. That's something that I said a little bit in the writing piece this week, is that it's described that the identity of these dogs is essentially completely wrapped around their job as being like a productive sled dog, and that more than their identity is wrapped up in it, regardless if a dog is injured or has been beaten or whatever has happened to it, the dog will like fight to return to its place within the pack. And like no matter if it's gonna essentially die from the labor of doing so, it will like fight you to get back into the position that you originally abused them to go into. And I suppose if I could go off on my first proper little side tangent before we return to the plot, that was kind of the main, or one of the main things I was taking away from the book. Before I finished it, I put some notes down on my phone, and it really seemed like at first we were commentating on the results of abuse, essentially. Buck is never described as hearing like a call for the wild, or this yearn for a deeper sense of freedom, or to fulfill the actions of what his ancestors were doing versus what he was doing. Like at the start of the story, Buck's chilling, my man. You know what I mean? Like Tony Montana montage style chilling. Like he's lying by lakes. He's chasing, little birds that people shoot when they're out hunting. He's, snapping wee sausages at picnics. Like my man's living his best life. He actually has no call. And again, we know that he doesn't even feel as deep a love and connection as he will go on to. So it just really made me think about the drive that we feel to do things, and if our needs are met, if we are comfortable and we're ticking the boxes, do we feel the drive to pursue more freedom, or pursue more of what we feel we truly are? Because that will mean change and sacrifice, and that change and sacrifice will come at the comfort of those things that are like ticking your boxes now. But again, to get closer on to what I really wanted to say, is it was reminding me of essentially a lot of PTSD stuff, and a lot of a veteran comes back from serving, and all of a sudden they've went from an environment where like every decision is heavily heavily matters. Every decision heavily is impacted by their duty, and by every single thing they do has some semblance of like meaning to it, either in a direct value sense or in a traditional sense. And by the time you return to the civilian world, the tools that you have learned to deal with the extreme situations that you're in, the extreme abuse that you go through, are no longer relative, or not relatable, but they're no longer useful. When you go back into the civilian world, and I've never done any military stuff, I'm sure it's not hard to tell, but when you do go back, everything is described as just being a bit intangible to you. Like it's hard to fathom that you care for updating tax documents, when the thing you cared about before was making sure that your whole group or your squad was safe, or wasn't being bombed by the enemy, or one of that. So it really felt like it was speaking to this whole idea that our abuse, or the things that we go through, shape the tools that we have to combat those solutions. And then when we are placed outside of those problems into a new context, even if it is a comforting context and situation, we will feel a natural yearning to return to the struggle that we know we can deal with, because we have the solutions. But before I move on, I'll leave it with one last comparison. Is in the show Community, which is a fantastic show, best of all time, the character Britta, played by Gillian Jacobs, has a speech where at one point she admits that one of her ex accused her of only being attracted to a certain type of man that was hurt. But she says, it was pretty hard to understand him because he was really high on paint thinner at the time. Which kind of goes to show the point. And I think that's a little bit of what I was connecting to in reading this, is that we kind of fall into these cycles of returning to things and feeling a call to things that aren't even that good for us and go against the comfort that we have now. But we have a call to it because of the sheer fact that we know how to handle that situation, because we've been through it so much. Okay, so again, if we return to the wee plot bit, we kind of get into the rest of the story, and the trade-off, at this point, again, Buck has went from the naive dog, he's trained up, he's become very, very competent, he's become bigger, stronger, more scars on his blood, more scars on his skin even, and at this point, he's going in and out, he's kind of coming and going with Thornton. Sometimes Thornton calls him, sometimes he just returns and hangs out with him for a little bit. And ultimately, what ends up happening is that when he returns, and I guess this is the spoiler for the thing towards the end of the book, so there's your warning. When he returns one day, he finds that Thornton has actually been killed, killed by the Native Americans that were there at that time. I'll not go into the whole George Carlin if that's a good term to use or not, but they're just described in the book as natives, and essentially we kick into gear at this point. Buck comes back, finds Thornton covered in like arrows and spears and stuff like that, and he just goes on a on a wild one. To be perfectly honest, no pun intended. He goes on a mad hunt for revenge. The abilities that he has gathered up to now by killing a bloody moose, by murdering a bear, by chasing a hare across a forest and becoming faster than it. All of this skill has essentially built up into him and allowed him to have the capacity to seek this revenge. And does he seek that revenge, brother? Man, he hits that thing. He runs, and there's a lot of description of throat ripping and stuff like that. Again, it's very violent. But essentially, Buck goes on his big revenge path, gets a lot of revenge, does a lot of murdering, and then he is even set as being remembered by the Yehats, is the tribe's name that they're called. Again, I'm not sure if that has proper relevancy. But the Yehats even go on to know Buck as like a spirit, essentially, as a folklore creature. They end up calling him the ghost dog because he like I said, he kind of tears the throats of his enemies, and he leads this new pack at night, kind of charging into the night, singing this song. And they go on to say that if they find someone, like if someone doesn't return to their camp who's going out on a search or something, it wouldn't be uncommon to go and to find them attacked and to have like massive wolf prints in the snow with the blood and stuff like that. So that is essentially kind of the end bit and the fallen action. That's kind of the climax and the fallen action is Buck seeks his revenge and then gets it, and he goes on to be known as this, this creature of folklore, this kind of warning mystery sign. And we kind of wrap up as Buck, like I said, is leading this pack, charging through the night, and he is now the one that is making the call. He is echoing the call out to people, for anyone near to hear and come to him and also feel the call of the wild. So that's essentially, the last part that happened plot-wise. I'd like to go into the couple thoughts that I had felt right towards the end of the book. Like, right as I finished the book, I kind of noted a couple of different things down. And honestly, I'm just going to read through the few things that I had actually noted down at the time, my proper thoughts. To be perfectly fair, these might just be, well, what's McConaughey say? Like fugazi. I'm not saying that any of this is what the book is trying to say, and I'm not saying that this is what Jack London's original intentions were, or that any of this is in agreement with anyone else that is much smarter than myself. But these are just some thoughts that I noted down, so I thought I'd share them with you today. Also, if you're still with me at this point, nearly 20 minutes in, thank you very much, and I really appreciate it. I hope you're having a good time. Okay. Yeah, so like I said, after finishing the book, the call really seems to be like a direct call for freedom. The freedom is used by Buck, like I said, to kill the kind of bigger animals, adapt to the new heights of other kind of predators. And, I thought that we are called to freedom, but with it, the demand that we adapt further into who we are and ultimately sacrificing what we previously held most close, which again, for Buck was essentially Thornton. So one must wonder if it is the animal's natural instinct, again referred to as their ancestors' embedded habits, which are the driving force to becoming this hunting idol, or was it the fear for his life from the beatings and rigorous focus on work, having its whole source of identity and happiness come from the completion of the task, which was the purpose of their captivity. So again, really going into this PTSD kind of mindset stuff, like, is the hunting its true desire, or is the new survival skills simply growing, per an expectation that was implanted during captivity? Is our purpose derived from a permanent historic set of tendencies, or are we too driven just by the abuse and or love around us, to hear a calling? Like, is the calling itself, is the calling our projection of what freedom looks like? Or, like, is it a fantasy to revel and kind of yearn for that was passed down? Or is it just like an ideal life that we feel denied per life's responsibilities? Because, again, but Buck didn't hear anything at the start. It was only after he had left the comfort that he once knew and went through the hardship and then found comfort again that he kind of felt this call, you know? And that's really what I was thinking, that he didn't hear the call at the start. He was a faithful, attentive family dog, but he felt no true love and no true desire to actually leave. He was content. And again, we must ask, is the feeling of freedom only noticed when we are removed from our usual understandings, as then we truly see the range of possibilities laid before us? Is it only in the case where one is already content to some level that they do not fathom freedom outside of what already meets their short-term pleasures or calms their worries? And I think I've saw some stuff about that before. This idea that if you give a person, I've saw it framed, if you give a man, but really if you give a person the comforts that tick the box, if you give them regular good food and social relationships and enough money that there's no like stress on them financially, that person will not have any motivation to strive to create some very westernized, capitalist system that is like a business and supports this wider factor and continues to grow for larger consumption, So that's really what I was kind of thinking, and like I said, the buck is happy when he answers the call, when he's running with the new wolf, when he's taking on the larger fights, and he even takes joy, like I said, in the small fights, like chasing the hare, the squirrels, the chipmunks, and kind of toying with these animals and killing them. He gets this kind of sick satisfaction, I suppose, out of it, which is really the power of the ability to take life, which again calls further to the whole true animalistic nature, I suppose, of what the call is. Maybe the call, again, in this whole thing, maybe it's not about freedom, but maybe it's like the opposite of freedom. Maybe the call is the de-evolution of moving towards like sheer power that you feel your ancestors like inhabited, and it's moving closer to wielding this true power. And I guess for Buck that would be, again, his sheer ability to survive and kill other things that are bigger than him, and maybe for us it would be more closer to a revolutionary sense. So honestly, dear listener, thank you for going with me on this journey. I'll finish with the last few things that I've written here, and we'll wrap up. Like that. Buck does. The Buck has the skills, to defeat that tribe. He kind of turns into this advanced wild predator, and I just thought it was interesting that obviously the tone when Thomas Thornton dies, when John Thornton dies, the focus really remains on the fact that the last connection to people has been broken. Like from the first time he was kidnapped to kind of the salvation of this owner, he finally had a real choice. Like, he had leeway, I would say, with John Thornton, but now he was actually free. He was free to decide what he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was to run with this pack, to repeat the call of the wild on for other people. that Buck found his freedom, and in turn, another layer of comfortability within himself once more, by the end of the story. He doesn't end by reflecting on his changes or his positive memories, but he ends rather by looking to the future and continuing the call of the wild himself as he sings into the night, leading his pack true. Passing on the call which once piqued his ears, sounded out to many that freedom is close by, and with it, a new nature entirely. So do we follow the call, or do we chase freedom, or do we stay in fear of what we may lose or whom we may become? Okay, yes, look, thank you very much for listening. I think that pretty much wraps up our talk on the Call of the Wild. It's not a review, so I don't really care to rate it. I would probably give it 5 stars, but again, this isn't a review. This is just a discussion of the material because I really enjoyed it. So yeah, look, thank you very much for listening. To all of this, if you made it to the end, remember to hit like and share it if you really want to. But yeah, remember to hit like on wherever you're listening to it. We're growing on Spotify, and we are surely growing slowly but surely, people, which is really exciting. So yes, thank you once more, and I appreciate it. And yes, hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you very much for listening. I've been Adam Dean, and this was an attempt to understand the Call of the Wild. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. See you next time. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.